Okay, good morning. My name is Ilka Starros. I'm working with GIZ, Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's webinar on making long-term low GHG emissions development strategies a reality. Before we get started, please allow me to introduce you and share some technical aspects of today's event. We will be very happy to actually discuss your questions which may come up during the inputs, but also the reflections on the topic today. In order for you to raise those questions, please use the button question and answers or the question and answer function, which you will see below on your screen, actually, with the in the browser. And please already raise your questions as soon as they come up. What you will see is possibly that you will get an information that your question is dismissed. That does not mean that we don't take up the question, but we have colleagues here in the background who help us to sort questions in order for us to make sure that we can cover as much as possible during the discussions. Furthermore, you see that you're automatically muted. In case later on that you would like to share information from your side, there will be a possibility also to unmute you by our administrator. And last but not least, this event is recorded, and by remaining in this call today, we assume that you agree to the recording of the event. Thank you very much. With that, now please allow me to get started and officially open our event today. Thank you very much for joining our webinar on making long-term low GHG emissions development strategies a reality. This is an event hosted by the New Climate Institute and jointly developed by New Climate Institute and GIZ. Please allow me to very quickly introduce both organizations to you, as some of you might not know them. GIZ is a global service provider in the field of international cooperation for sustainable development and international education work. GIZ is a public benefit federal enterprise, and in that regard supports the German government and many public and private sector clients currently in approximately 120 countries in achieving their objectives in international cooperation. My name is Ilka Starros. I am working for GIZ as a program manager of the regional program on capacity development for climate policy. New Climate Institute is a Germany-based think tank. And the New Climate Institute, with its work, aims at raising ambition for action against climate change and in support for sustainable development through research work, policy design, and knowledge sharing activities. This webinar today, actually, but also the guidance document, which will be referred to in some of the inputs, both were elaborated in the frame of the regional project I just mentioned, the full name being Capacity Development for Climate Policy in Eastern Europe, Southern Caucasus, and Central Asia. This project is financed by the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety through funds of the International Climate Initiative, and that is an initiative of the German government. It is implemented by GIZ, and New Climate Institute acts as an implementing partner in the program, especially in cooperation context of NDC revision, climate action planning, but also knowledge management on the topics. This is just to give you a quick overview of the context where this webinar was elaborated. Now, regarding the topic of today's webinar, probably many of you already know that with the Paris Agreement, parties to the agreement collectively committed toward global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, and actually aim at limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And as also many of us know, the latest scientific evidence shows that this would mean there is a very strong need for countries to initiate decarbonization processes for their economies, such that by the second half of this century, their net zero greenhouse gas emissions level globally can be achieved. In this context, the Paris Agreement includes an Article 4, which calls on the parties to formulate and communicate so-called long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies and to submit them to the UNFCCC Secretariat by 2020, meaning this year. This is a requirement which is additional to the revision process of the nationally determined contributions. So this year, 5 years after Paris Agreement, NDCs shall be revised and communicated to the Secretariat as well as long-term strategies. Today's webinar we would like to devote to sharing and discussing with you recommendations to policymakers on how to approach the development of so-called LTS, considering the different and unique circumstances of individual countries this year. And of course, knowing that we have a very special situation this year with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we would like to furthermore discuss in this context questions of economic recovery planning of countries from the impacts of the pandemic. We structured this webinar in a way that we would like to start with several short thematic inputs. Those will be followed then with some time where we could clarify questions of understanding which you might have from the inputs, followed again with a panel discussion. And we would like to use this panel discussion on the one hand to discuss some questions which I have on my mind, but of course also to allow to use questions which you might have for the panelists to discuss. I'm very happy actually today that we will have panelists as input providers of New Climate Institute, the 2050 Pathways platform, as well as GIZ. And we look forward, of course, also for your feedback and possibly inputs. Let me kindly remind you once more to use the question and answer function also already during the presentations, especially if you have any questions of understanding. And with that, I'm very glad to be able to provide the stage to our first input provider, which is Thomas Day of the New Climate Institute. Tom works with national governments in several countries to support the development of climate planning, including the interaction between NDCs, LTS, and sector-level policies. And the first input of Tom, he will use to explore how harmonized revision cycles of LTS and NDCs can improve the alignment of a country's long-term vision and medium-term targets and make sure that strategies are actually grounded on the latest available science. Tom, the digital stage is yours.
Very many thanks, Ilka. Good morning, everybody. As Ilka mentioned, what we're presenting comes from a guidance document, or the first couple of presentations come from a guidance document on long-term strategy development, which was published a couple of months ago. So towards the end of the webinar, or at the end of the webinar, we will be sharing with you the link for that publication, which is available both in English and Spanish. We're going to take you now through the three main concepts that come in this guidance document. And the first one is making the case for the ongoing revisions of LTSs beyond 2020. And the concept that we're making is that making harmonized revision cycles of LTSs and NDCs can improve the alignment of a country's long-term vision and medium-term targets in the future. So let's drill into this a little bit. This is a graph that you're probably quite aware of. We look at it quite often. So we see historical emissions rising and how the IPCC recommendations have been changing in the stringency that is called for due to delayed action. I think why this is especially relevant now when we talk about long-term strategies is because now more than ever before, we really need that long-term vision to give us an indication of how drastic the action is that we need to take today. When we look at the recommendations for 2017, then perhaps it was a little bit more manageable to think of the short term and think what kind of marginal improvements can we make, and this was likely to be aligned with a Paris-aligned scenario, whereas now in 2020, only when we look at the long-term Paris-aligned pathway do we really get a taste of what drastic action we need to take up to 2030 to turn our economies around. So it's really important to be looking into the future in order to get the ambition level that we need. And this is reflected in the Paris Agreement. This is why in the Paris Agreement, as Ilka mentioned, Article 4 calls on parties to do this. But what's missing is some clear regulations or guidance, both from the Paris Agreement or from the Katowice rulebook, on exactly how this should happen. What is the role of the LTS? Why should countries do it? This is something where there's a little bit of information lacking, where we hope to be able to fill a bit of a gap. Firstly, what's the status quo of LTS development? This is a survey that was conducted last year, November 2019. At that point, we saw that around 52% of the national government respondents that we were able to reach, which was around 86 countries, around 52% of those respondents said that they're either in the process of developing an LTS or that they plan to start it soon. We see the update of this report, of the NDC update report, which was published in November last year, is actually coming in 2 weeks. And we see that, unfortunately, there's not necessarily been a big development here in this regard. The expectations from last year haven't necessarily completely come through, and we still see a lot of respondents in the position that they haven't actually started the LTS revision process yet. Many reasons quoted, including the delays caused by the pandemic, of course, but also prioritization of other climate processes in this busy climate year. But we'll come back to that shortly. So why align the NDCs and LTSs and how? We know that the NDC process, that we have a 5-year revision cycle. So we're currently in the middle of that in 2020, and there'll be another one by the latest 2025. And these are set in stone by the Paris Agreement. And this provides a good time to do exactly the same thing for the long-term strategy. And why? Because this allows policymakers to be informed about what is a sensible level of ambition for their NDC. If they know what the direction is that they're going in, if they can chart a decarbonization pathway, then this clearly sets a sensible level of ambition for the NDC and allows policymakers to stay up to date with the latest science and the latest developments in terms of cost reductions, accessibility of technologies. So this is how it can look. As I said, we're currently in the submission cycle in 2020, where countries are being asked to submit LTSs and NDCs at the same time. For 2025 and 2030, then we'd recommend that we have a very similar process, that countries also revise their LTSs either in those years or maybe slightly before, in order to allow that the NDC can be informed by that. This is particularly important since in this year, what we think we're observing, although we can't be entirely sure yet until all the submissions come out, is that there's a little bit of a lack of alignment between the LTS processes and the NDC processes. Both of these processes happening in 2020 provided an excellent opportunity for harmonization, consolidation of these processes. Unfortunately, we haven't necessarily seen that. So what we have heard from respondents of our survey for the NDC update report, for example, is in many cases, the LTS has been postponed due to limited resources available in a difficult year, and the prioritization to update the NDC. So instead of doing these two things in combination, we see a lot of countries have prioritized to do the NDC this year and think about doing the LTS once that's finished. That's understandable, but it would represent a really big missed opportunity in terms of benchmarking the ambition of the NDC on something that is Paris compatible. And that makes it even more important for the LTS to play this role again in the future and not to be a single standalone document today or in 1 year. Of course, there are examples of countries that have been able to do this, that have been able to consolidate their processes, and where their NDCs are really well aligned with their long-term strategies. But this could be an aim for all countries. So what exactly are the benefits to policymakers for doing this? So one thing is that it makes it easier in the short term to do these NDC updates and to set short-term targets. Most countries are finding that it's easier to reach a political consensus when they're setting a target for 2050 or 2060 than when they're setting a target for 2030. And once that political consensus on the long-term target is set, then it really it already charts out a decarbonization pathway, which makes it easier to establish a consensus on those shorter term targets. If we start from zero each time, then it's very difficult to work out and come together to agree on short-term targets. Whereas if we already have agreed on a long-term trajectory, then this becomes a much more straightforward process, or it can do at least. One other reason is to provide the private sector with a long-term signal. We see on the one hand that private sector actors can sometimes be understandably resistant to short-term regulation that they haven't foreseen. On the other hand, we're also seeing, since the Paris Agreement set a clear long-term signal in 2015, that many private sector actors, including from many high carbon industries, are showing readiness and willingness to adapt once they have a clear direction on which way they're going. And if this is an opportunity for countries to set that clear direction at the national level so the private sector can adapt accordingly. A third reason is finance or international support. Many international support providers, multilateral development banks, but also bilateral facilities are making it very clear that they want to prioritize countries that have a clear, comprehensive plan for long-term decarbonization. So setting out a long-term strategy can also be attractive for this perspective as well. And lastly, this can also simplify NDC revision processes in the future. It sounds like it could be another process, that it could be more work for climate change ministries, but once a long-term strategy is set, adopted and agreed, and once this is just a case of updating that and seeing where are we on the pathway, can we go a little bit further, then a lot of the discussions, a lot of the political process of NDC revisions could be considerably streamlined, making this perhaps a more efficient process in the future. So that was the first concept, making the case for why LTS development should be an iterative process. The second concept that we introduce is to show that LTS development doesn't necessarily always need to be a completely comprehensive document, but can be dependent on country-specific contexts. And what we've done, and what my colleague Julie will explain in a bit more detail in a moment, is that we've set 3 levels of comprehensiveness for how LTSs can be developed. Not all countries are going to be in a position that they're ready to prepare a comprehensive, detailed LTS based on in-depth underlying analysis. But if we don't see an LTS as a one-off standalone document, then that's fine. If we see that it's an iterative process where we'll be revising this on at least a 5-yearly basis, then it's okay to start with a base version or an intermediate version, depending on what capabilities are available, and improve this as we go through. Depending on the availability of technical and financial resources, human resources, and the political mandate, these can be factors that could limit or enable that today in 2020 or in the future that we're able to build on the versions or the LTS versions that we've set. And I would now hand over to my colleague Julie, who will look at how we've set this base, intermediate and detailed version according to 8 key aspects that can come into LTS development.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. Yes, as said, I will introduce to you the 8 key elements that we identified that a long-term strategy should include based on a literature review we performed last year on other LTS guidances. And then I will explain with 2 of the elements how we propose to apply the concept of the 3 levels of comprehensiveness. Next slide, please. So we start looking at the process, which is the first step basically of developing a long-term strategy. And as Tom mentioned, we see a long-term strategy more of a process than a one-time document submission. We think the long-term strategy needs to be a process over time, and that relates also to the last element, looking at the outlook. As Tom mentioned, we see it as an iterative process, developing an ongoing vision, and acknowledging the fact that the future is always uncertain. So that the long-term strategy and this vision will need to be adapted over time. The process refers to the fact that the long-term strategy alone will not be as impactful as a process of developing a long-term vision along national processes. So basically incorporating the long-term strategy in, for example, sectoral plans, having consultative processes and stakeholder engagement, trying to include all stakeholders in the process, coordinate as well throughout the ministries, yes, and align maybe also with, for example, climate change law. So we think this process does not actually change between the base, intermediate, or detailed version. It's a must for all countries, basically. Yeah, next slide. Then we come to the next point, which is a theoretical long-term scenario analysis. Here we do think that it makes quite a difference between the base, intermediate, and detailed version, acknowledging that not all countries will be able in the short term to develop robust scenarios. We think these scenarios should be always acknowledging the latest scientific findings. And if you can go to the next slide. Here, exactly. So in the base version, we think that a country could acknowledge latest scientific findings, which in this case, or in our case now, would be the IPCC special report on 1.5, global warming of 1.5. It can be as much as acknowledging the need to go to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, for example. What we recommend is also to have consultative process and already in the LTS mention the next steps to develop scenarios. In the intermediate version, similarly, we recommend to also acknowledge the science, but maybe already develop a high-level economy-wide scenario, even if it's only indicative in the first version. Or, for example, also have a detailed sectoral pathway for one of the main sectors. And in the detailed version, this would be the most comprehensive development of scenarios over time, making use of country-specific evidence and having a robust process to model the scenarios in a cooperative process between researchers and policymakers between the different ministries. Yeah, next slide. Here, so this graph looks a bit complicated, but I will take you through it. Basically, if we look at 2020, so today, a country would develop projections. So projecting, these are the gray shaded lines, the number ones. You would have the current policy or NDC projection as of 2020 with more or less stagnating emissions. If a country would develop now a Paris-aligned or long-term pathway, it could be the bottom number one gray shaded line, reflecting the highest plausible ambitions and projecting these emissions. Now, if we move 5 years into the future, we're in 2025, and looking back, we see that maybe the emissions did not go as planned, but they were not as high as the current policy projections, but also did not follow the highest plausible ambition path, maybe because of a lack of capacities or finance. What we think is important then is to update both the NDC and the LTS, meaning that in 2025, taking the historical emissions, a country could adjust the current policy projection. So now I'm talking about the number 3, the red lines. And as well also update the highest plausible ambition projection, taking into account, for example, new scientific evidence or the development of technologies, as well as maybe an exponential decrease of certain clean technologies such as solar wind power, meaning that in 5 years the highest plausible ambition may be a different path than the one previously elaborated. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here I want to highlight basically the Portuguese long-term strategy, because it developed these scenarios quite neatly. It's an example of a detailed version of scenario modeling. And an important factor is that Portugal acknowledged the latest science, the IPCC special report on 1.5, and does aim for net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And on the next slide, you see the main result, let's say, of the long-term strategy, of the modeling exercise. So again, this is a detailed version, so very comprehensive. It's modeled the researchers and policymakers involved in the modeling, which was a very cooperative process, including consultation phases. They developed 3 different scenarios that went through different iterative phases, so peer reviewing the scenarios over the development, and then agreeing on one of the scenarios. And this is the graph you can see now in the slide. So they agreed to reach net zero emissions or CO2 emissions by 2050. What you see on the positive side of the emission scala is the residue emissions, but then the gray shaded area are are negative emissions from the forest and land use sector. So overall reaching net zero emissions. What is interesting as well is that here you can see the pathway for each sector, and how the long-term strategy was developed is that this final scenario enables to backcast intermediate greenhouse gas targets in 2030, for example. It can also provide a path for each sector to know the role of each sector in reaching net zero emissions. And it also enables non-greenhouse gas target elaboration, because the scenario would basically inform which technologies play which role as well in the scenario. Yes. So we see so there are 6 more key elements to long-term strategies that I don't have time to go through now. But overall, we think that for the development of long-term strategies, as well as further revisions in the future, there is a need for clearer guidance on how to develop long-term strategies in an iterative process. An example could be an online platform to track and share experiences. We see already, I think it's a bit over 15 long-term strategies submitted that are very informative and can help other countries or policymakers in developing their own long-term strategies. And there is really a need for collective experiences and support and learning from each other, especially because this is kind of a new task. And on the next slide, here's the reference to the guidance document that Tom mentioned before. We have also developed a long-term strategy hub that summarizes the findings we partly present here into a website, a hub, and we also make use of other long-term strategy guidance in that hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Allow me very quickly to introduce you to the audience. Julie Amrich is also working for and with the New Climate Institute, and she has been tracking the submission of long-term strategies as they were submitted over the past years, and also here drawing out good practices and lessons that can be shared. As you might imagine, Julie was also one of the authors of the LTS guidance document. Julie, Tom, thank you very much for your inputs on possible process design for LTS elaboration and the question of the possibility to approach the LTS elaboration with regard to different levels of comprehensiveness of the document. What I am very glad to do now is to introduce you to Frederick Hans, also of the New Climate Institute, who actually was the lead author of the LTS guidance document, but we'll talk on a bit different subject. Frederick has been tracking and analyzing countries' COVID-19 economic recovery packages to draw out good practices for green recovery, because of course the LTS elaboration and NDC revision processes this year are all done while a global pandemic happens, and countries prepare and try to prepare themselves to answer questions how their economies can recover from the impacts of the pandemic. Frederick will provide an overview of countries' progress in the development of green recovery packages, and will discuss how the economic recovery from COVID-19 could present challenges and opportunities for the development of more ambitious long-term climate strategies. Frederick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So as we can see on the next slide, and I think most of you are aware of this, the fiscal action that we have seen by governments to date is really at unprecedented scale. The charts we see here on the left, which come from the IMF, I estimate that in total, globally, around $12 trillion have been spent as of September 2020. So not even considering the last quarter of this year. But while we of course see that again, total action is very kind of at unprecedented scale, we see a quite large discrepancy between G20 member countries, or also more advanced developed economies, and more middle and lower income economies, as the IMF classifies them. So GDP, the G20 kind of hovers around 20 or 15% of GDP, while the lower income countries below 6%. This is, of course, not necessarily a very surprising finding, but it's certainly important to acknowledge when discussing economic rescue and recovery in 2020. What is also important is to kind of differentiate a little bit between the rescue type spending and the recovery type spending. So basically all countries have used sort of immediate rescue type spending to weather the impacts of the crisis. And then first and foremost, of course, the health impacts, but then also the immediate socio-economic impacts. Whereas for this sort of recovery type spending, we see quite a bit of a difference between countries. So some countries have started to set up these recovery type stimulus plans that are perhaps also a little bit more sort of well thought through with a bit more time available. However, there are many countries that are still not yet at this stage, or still in sort of a preparatory phase for this. So when assessing what the status quo is, this is certainly important to consider. And what we can see on the next slide is that, of course, when we discuss fiscal recovery spending, it is very important to look at the different dimensions that policymakers kind of consider when setting up their stimulus recovery spending. So of course, and first and foremost, almost is really the sort of economic dimension. So measures need to be timely. They need to generate employment, also ideally near-term employment opportunities, and they need to create economic multiplier effects and be realistic within available fiscal resources for the respective government. But then, of course, there's also the other part, the more perhaps long-term impact, and that's then really the climate and environment, and of course also social benefit dimension. And this is just really important to assess that when we speak about what some people call the green recovery or opportunities for a green recovery, it's really combining these kind of short-term economic benefits with the longer-term climate and environment benefits. Just to quickly, Tom, if you can go back once more, just to quickly sort of define the terms, because also that is quite important in that discussion. It's really that when we speak of a low carbon recovery, we really mean measures that trigger new low carbon investments or further development of such technologies. While when we speak about high carbon, this includes both sort of the reinforcement of an unsustainable business as usual, as well as new high carbon investments. And then there is the sort of neutral and unclear impact category that of course also still is large as information is just coming in. And now to the next slide. When we look across countries and the different trackers and analyses that are available, and here on the left side, it's only one example from the energy policy tracker for selected numbers of non-OECD countries, we see that currently the measures that have been undertaken until basically November 2020 is they support a high carbon status quo. And that is mainly driven that in these first stages of initial rescue type spending, most governments, also very understandably, of course, have supported kind of emission intensive industries and their emission intensive industries. And we only see that a few countries have very deliberately already then included more low carbon measures in their packages. So that's a bit the sort of status quo as of today. But again, and that relates to the point that I made before on the other slide, is that we are still kind of in the process. And this might, of course, change over time if governments then decide to implement it. However, all these sort of assessments and analyses, and that's also always important to emphasize, they are preliminary in nature. But of course, and that's simply also a quite obvious fact, is that if high carbon investments in certain high carbon infrastructure will take place as part of this recovery, this will certainly lead to an emissions lock-in, and that could then potentially put the feasibility of NDC targets and also long-term targets by 2050 into jeopardy or into question. So this is very important then to consider that also for governments now when they set up their recovery spending in the second or then even third phase of fiscal interventions. So if we look at the next slide, how can governments unfold in an effective and sustainable economic recovery? First of all, I think our take is that the COVID pandemic really shows that or re-emphasizes the need for well-designed NDCs and long-term strategies. Because basically, when we look at these multiple dimensions of that framework that we've seen 2 slides before, it is really important for government to have information at hand where actually to put their scarce fiscal resources into. And in this case, these climate plans and the midterm plan in the NDC and then also the long-term plan in the LTS can provide very valuable guidance on where that should be. And for example, if countries would have project pipelines that are well aligned with those NDCs and LTSs, this is really something they can draw up on to then decide, okay, which are those measures that then also score very high in terms of an economic multiplier effect. So again, this really shows, or at least theoretically, how governments can use the NDCs and LTSs to kind of guide their economic recovery. Of course, the international donor community will have an important role, particularly presumably in also the next stages of fiscal interventions, as developing countries then will also set up hopefully their recovery plans and try to stimulate the economy. Under, of course, then sometimes very limited fiscal space and already high indebtedness before the crisis. In general, and this is also something that, no, if you stay on that slide, please. Yeah, thanks. We've seen several proposals made by a range of different institutions on exactly applying a do not harm principle and having certain measures that combine exactly these economic and environmental and climate benefits. So for instance, we spoke about it before, the corporate liquidity support to companies. We've seen to date that this has mainly happened without any conditions for low carbon transition, but this is certainly something that governments still can also take up. And then, of course, then there are also direct investments in nature-based solution, for instance, or loans and grants in low carbon investments in different sectors. And what is interesting on the next slide is that recent research and analysis also shows us that this is actually the case. So that there are measures, and this is, for instance, a well-cited study from the Oxford University from April 2020, where they show that it was a survey among finance ministries and central bank officials and other economists, and that there are these measures, for instance, the ones I circled up here in clean energy investments and clean R&D spending, green spaces and natural investments, that really score high both on the economic multiplier and the climate impact. So this is really something that then also policymakers can look at to assess in their country-specific context, of course, what is most appropriate and what basically includes that and considers both aspects. And on the next slide, what we see, and this is taken from the forthcoming UNEP emissions gap report that will be released in the beginning of this December, is that there are emerging examples where countries do exactly this. So where they look at kind of recovery measures that in the short term deliver on these economic components, but then also acknowledge sort of the low carbon transition that they committed to. So for instance, Chile with their green credit program, or Nigeria with a relatively expensive or comprehensive installation of solar home system program, where they also then acknowledge, for instance, and emphasize the opportunity for near-term employment when rolling out such clean energy investments. And also just to emphasize that again, it's not necessarily that governments in this context would need to kind of reinvent the wheel, but they could really lean up on existing project pipelines and sort of accelerate what is planned there to really be able to turn this around relatively quickly. And there are also other examples as here listed here for Ethiopia and Pakistan, for instance, where governments have then also put these natural infrastructure investments in green spaces as key pillars of their recovery planning. Again, in the forthcoming report, there will be more examples that one can further look at. And as the last slide, we just quickly wanted to also present sort of upcoming research that has sort of, or analysis that has surveyed expectations among policymakers and experts in the field. And what is interesting to see is that although, again, what we track so far and see in the countries where we would say this is rather reinforcing a status quo, those surveys show that expectations generally are rather positive about that climate action will get more prominence in the short to medium term as well, and that also in further recovery interventions there will be certain low carbon measures included. However, of course, there remains high uncertainty how this will unfold, and also we've seen in some of those surveys that, of course, policymakers are aware that this might also slow down the country's response and ambition, perhaps, particularly in a country-specific context on how the pandemic unfolds. So this is a bit sort of the input linking what the economic recovery kind of how it can unfold in the ongoing revision or update of NDCs, and of course elaboration of LTSs in 2020 and 2021.
Thank you very much, Frederic, for sharing this quite diverse picture, which one can observe at the moment, but which also gives reason for hope, I suppose. With that, actually, I believe the next input will be very interesting to add to Frederic's presentation. I'm very happy today to welcome Siddharth Pathak to the webinar. Siddharth is the Director of Partnerships at the 2050s Pathways platform, and in this function he oversees the relationship of the platform with member governments, stakeholders and prospective partners to support them in developing a 2050s strategy. Siddharth, I would like very much to invite you to the digital stage and invite you to discuss the momentum of ambitious long-term strategy development and how this has been actually affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the emergence of green recovery packages. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eka. And good morning, everyone. I just wanted to very quickly say that a lot that has been said completely aligns with what I'm going to say. But I wanted to add a few more sort of insights from the discussions that we've had with countries who are developing the long-term strategies. Just as a quick introduction, the 2050 Pathways platform was established in 2016, end of 2016. Primarily with the intention to support governments in developing their long-term strategy, but to also provide a space for governments to have an exchange, primarily because of the fact that there was no guidance on how to develop a long-term strategy. In 2016 and or 2016, there were 4 long-term strategies that had been submitted to the UNFCCC, most of them extremely heavy on the modeling side, but not necessarily very comprehensive for the time being. But the idea behind the platform is to sort of bring the community together to sort of create some sort of a guidance or a space for countries to discuss how ambitious long-term strategies could be developed and what could be the elements for that. If you look at this map, it sort of broadly gives you a sense of the long-term strategies that are under development or have been submitted. 19 have been submitted till date, with Finland being the last one that had submitted their strategy, I think 2 months ago, or probably a month ago. And we're expecting that by COP26, there'll be around 50 plus strategies that will be submitted to the UNFCCC. Now, if you actually break down this number, 50 might not look big, but all the G7 countries have or will soon have their long-term strategy submitted to the UNFCCC. The last one, I think, being Italy, hopefully by the end of this month, end of this year. And all the G7 countries have an aim towards net zero. This is sort of taking into account that the US with the new administration would probably embed the sort of net zero dimension into an official policy. If you take into account the G20 countries, most of them, again, are developing their long-term strategies, not necessarily towards net zero. So there will be a multitude of strategies that will be coming from the G20, especially the emerging economies within the G20 framework. The 2 countries that, as of now, we don't have a very clear sense whether they'll do a long-term strategy or not is Brazil and Saudi Arabia. They are unlikely to submit their long-term strategy by COP26. And Turkey might submit their strategy beyond COP26 because it's just started. If you look at the overall picture, most of the OECD country, which is around 32, 33 countries, are actually submitting their long-term strategy, and most of them are aiming towards net zero. If you look at the upcoming sort of milestone in the climate sort of space, the 12/12 event, we're hoping that there'll be around 5 or 6 long-term strategies from countries across the world that will be submitted in probably 2 weeks' time. So the number on 19 would probably increase to 20, 25. But on the flip side, if you start looking at ambition, and if you remember the sort of second slide from Thomas, it basically talked about the 1.5 sort of imperative and how countries need to think of net zero emissions. Now, in the past, there's been a lot of emphasis on committing to net zero, especially in the previous COP. There were a large group of countries that submitted their intention to actually, or their support for net zero emissions. But unfortunately, a lot of those are still just commitments to the UNFCCC. We do not see that they are developing a long-term strategy that is in line with their net zero emission commitment towards 2050. We don't necessarily see a lot in law or policy. And that's especially true for some of the countries, particularly on the African continent. But it's diametrically stark if you look at where countries are developing their long-term strategy and those who have actually committed to a net zero commitment at the previous COP. Now, if you look at some of the reflections from our end, when you look at the COVID crisis that happened, that we're going through, obviously a big part of it is in delay of submissions. Countries were expected to prepare their strategies and submit them by 2020. But just like the NDCs, there's sort of an implicit understanding that that deadline has sort of shifted a year, and now countries are supposed to submit their long-term strategies by COP26, even though nothing was really said, but I think that's the implicit understanding amongst all the countries. I think the big sort of impact is on consultations, because the long-term strategies weren't in our discussions with the government and how we've sort of portrayed the long-term strategy, and how even Julie talked about the long-term strategy. You think of the long-term strategy as a tool to sort of embark on a transformative journey for your country's sort of economy. And you think of how the emission trajectory for the country will look like in the sort of longer term. But there's also a very strong element besides modeling on the consultation part. And that sort of element can actually build consensus around very higher ambition, whether you look at the 2050 number or whether you're looking at the shorter term number. But it also sort of allows you to think of how you can make a lot of the other ministries aware. One of the sort of big problems in the climate space is that most of the climate policy, if you don't have an institutionalization of climate change in the country, are sort of hosted at the Ministry of Environment, or maybe the Foreign Affairs, or one particular ministry that's mostly engaging in the UNFCCC. And that has a direct impact on the sort of awareness that is there on climate change across the ministries in itself. So we were, in our sort of discussions with the government and the governments that we support, we've always pressed them on having very whole of government sort of an approach to the long-term strategy, as well as having a lot of consultations. And that has had a massive impact because of the COVID crisis. Most of the consultations have become virtual. Countries had a learning curve to actually learn how to do things virtually, just like a lot of us. We sort of learn to live a different life altogether in the virtual world. And I think the hardest hit is actually those people that are on the front lines of climate change, because those people in a lot of countries don't have access to the internet. And it's very hard to actually reach through consultations to those people. And we are sort of finding new ways in which we could do consultations over the phone and things like that. But it's extremely hard to actually bring people together and to get in touch with certain people who are extremely on the sort of fringes on the online network space. And I think that, to me, is the biggest sort of impact on the consultation side that we've seen in many countries, especially the lower middle income countries, as well as even in the emerging economies, especially on the marginalized communities that aren't necessarily sort of part of the sort of online space. The second thing, or the trend that is actually quite interesting to see, is exactly on what Frederick said, which is on, we've always sort of emphasized on a whole of government approach. And I think because of this economic recovery planning, as well as a lot of the discussions outside of the environmental space around green recovery, or whether the sort of fiscal packages that are to be developed, there is a big sort of disconnect between what the finance ministries are thinking of and what the environment ministries are thinking of on the NDC and the long-term strategy. And I think because of the larger sort of push for green recovery, and because of the larger sort of emphasis on connecting the two worlds, a lot of governments are starting to think of the whole of government approach in a lot more positive way. So we are seeing many governments actually talk to the Treasury. We are seeing that that they're trying to talk to the Finance Ministry to actually bring those two together in order to actually have a design for the longer term. This wasn't necessarily the case because you see or you have consultations where participants are invited, but it's not really joint approach, or it's not co-developed in that sense. But I think now, because of the COVID crisis and because of this sort of link that people are seeing with the economic recovery, a lot of people are emphasizing on co-developing the long-term strategy alongside the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Planning that is also responsible for the COVID recovery packages. So hopefully the upcoming strategies from some of these countries will actually be a lot more comprehensive and would sort of the indicators that Frederick sort of talked about will shift in our favor. The last one is on the emergence of the net zero benchmark. I think this has had a huge impact on the long-term strategies, particularly. I think, like I said, a lot of countries are developing in the G20 countries are developing their long-term strategies without necessarily an agreement on net zero or a commitment or a political commitment to net zero. But the announcements from the EU and then subsequently announcements from China, Japan, Korea, as well as the sort of US election outcome and the sort of incoming administration having to say that they're aiming for net zero, has resulted in net zero becoming a sort of a benchmark for long-term climate ambition. And that actually has triggered in many of the countries that have been developing their long-term strategy, this understanding that we should probably think of at least one scenario in the long-term strategy that aims towards net zero, or we should at least try to think of a net zero sort of commitment for ourselves. And that sort of is directly connected to another trend, which is around trade, that is actually having a feedback, especially the EU Green Deal, which is having a feedback into a lot of the discussions that governments are doing, especially those governments that have a high sort of trading output from fossil fuels or are sort of resource extractive countries in general, but also those countries that have a huge agricultural sort of export from them. So they are actually actively thinking that if our sort of markets that we are supplying to are actually turning net zero, should we start thinking of sectoral transformations in particular areas where we are exporting to them? And that again has become quite an interesting trend to actually take into account when you're looking at the long-term strategy. So it's not so much about just submitting to the UNFCCC, but using the long-term strategy as a tool to actually rethink and reshape the way the economy will function in a completely different sort of setting. And with the net zero sort of commitment, that setting is becoming more and more clearer that countries will go to net zero, and thus we will also have to start thinking about net zero as an imperative. So I would leave it at that, but I think I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any other clarifications. I know I ran through the maps quite quickly, but if there are specific questions on particular countries, I'm happy to answer the status at least. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, for your very valuable input. And I believe, and that's an invitation, of course, to the audience also, there will be room now to discuss, reflect further. Before we will go into a panel discussion mode, I would like to provide a bit of room to discuss. Hold on, I just get the information that the video is not turned on. You cannot see me.
No, it's fine. Yeah, we can see you.
Fine. All right, sorry, that was my laptop not cooperating or the camera not cooperating for some reason. Okay, I would like to provide some space for direct technical questions of understanding to the inputs, and I understand there were a couple of questions which were raised. Before we will address those, please let me kindly invite you again, everybody of you, to raise your questions, but also possibly if you would like to share insights from your side using the question and answer function. It's on the down side of your desktop on the lower end. You will see a button, Q&A. Please use that function. Do not raise your hands because we run the risk that we will not see your raised hands, because we do have quite some participants and we have colleagues who gather the questions which you communicate in the question and answer space. Yeah. Okay, let me quickly see which questions we have. Tom, I believe there's a question regarding your input from Medea Inashvili. What do you mean when saying that updated NDCs may not be informed for or in 2020?
Thanks, Elke, and thanks, Medea. Certainly, I didn't mean to say that NDCs will not be informed in 2020. I hope they will, but we have the impression and the insights from the surveys we've been conducting this year that that they may not be informed by the long-term strategies in a lot of cases. So for many countries, some countries have been able to develop both in parallel, in which case when they're developing their NDC target, they can clearly see what pathway do we plan for our LTS, and that is informing the NDC target. But in many cases, there's been delays to the LTS development, as I mentioned, and also as Siddharth has mentioned, due to the difficulties of this year. And that means that in many cases, countries are developing NDCs without having done their LTS processes already. And in this regard, it's a missed opportunity for the NDCs to be informed by the LTSs in this window. That's not the case in every country, but it appears to be the case in many of them.
Thank you very much, Tom. Another question I propose and invite maybe Julie to answer the question, a question from Kirsten Orschulek. What are the recommended models for bottom-up approach or approaches for each sector to be used for the LTS emission modeling?
Yes, thank you for the question. I would say first that I do not really want to recommend specific modeling softwares or approaches. I think there are two ways to develop scenarios. First is to understand actually the top-down, so understanding what is a 1.5 aligned emission reduction pathway. And for that, well, there are many IAMs, but of course they're not on a country level. But it can also be as simple as acknowledging overall reducing emissions by half by 2030 and reaching net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And also making use of sectoral benchmarks that exist and that can inform scenario modeling. I think then from the bottom-up approach of developing a scenario, I said there are many out there, I think. Many countries already use different types of scenarios, and in the end, anything that works is fine. At New Climate, we even use Excel-based approaches, basically. So I think the main point is to not try to reinvent the wheel, but make use of what exists. And I think many scenarios are out there already to inform such pathways.
Thank you very much. As far as I can see, those were all questions directly linked to clarify and questions of understanding regarding the inputs. With that, actually, I would like to invite all the input providers, plus one more colleague of mine, who I will introduce just now, to the digital panel. I must say that it's a bit of a challenge for me because moderating a panel where you see the panelists directly in front of you is, of course, much more convenient than to do that digitally, but I hope that we will manage. So we will have Siddharth Pathak, Thomas Day, Frederick Hans, and Julie Emmerich on our panel chairs, and I'm very happy to introduce you to my colleague Lisa Herrmann, who is the Climate Policy Advisor with GIZ. And Lisa can look back to quite some extensive experiences advising governments of partner countries on their INDC elaboration in 2015 and beforehand, also on NDC implementation processes and MRV systems. And Lisa also has coordinated for several years the Latin American regional group of the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement. At the moment, Lisa is responsible to coordinate a GIZ internal community of practice, which actually deals with long-term strategies. Lisa, welcome to our panel as well. I would actually like to raise my first question to you, Lisa. Before I do that, please let me invite everybody here of the audience also to raise questions you would like to address to the panel, maybe also share reflections from your side, and we will try to integrate it. Lisa, you're in contact with many different actors and countries in the frame of your work. Actors and countries which actively work on NDC revision as well as LTS elaboration. Could you reflect a bit on some aspects of the guidance and share some insights how countries actually do approach LTS elaboration in reflecting their own specific circumstances?
Sure. Thank you, Ilka. Many thanks for the kind introduction and also for the interesting presentations of the other speakers. So GIZ supports LTS development or contributes to elements of it in around 20 countries. This just as a background information. My impression is that many of the 8 aspects that were raised by Julie are somehow reflected in the processes for LTS development of our partner countries or are planned to do to be done at some point. And I totally agree with that. A good and inclusive process is key for the success of the LTS. And it helps also to ensure that the LTS is not just a document, but that it's actually implemented and mainstreamed into decision making. And for this, it's crucial to get the relevant stakeholders on board. Yeah, I agree totally with Siddharth's approach of having a whole of government approach. So bringing them all on board and thinking together about pathways to a climate neutral society. And to get those sectoral ministries on board, it really helps to frame the LTS work not as an ecological on top exercise, but rather as a strategy of national interest, since it supports the identification of future risks and it helps to avoid stranded assets and lock-ins that will otherwise make it much more expensive in the future to get back on a climate neutral path. So yeah. And I would like to highlight 2 concepts of the guidance that I find very important. One is the iterative approach, and the other one, the different levels of comprehensiveness. So I totally agree with that. It makes sense to have an iterative approach. As we see with the pandemic, the context can change rapidly, so that it's important to have the chance to update. And but what we see in many countries is that such an update is not that easy because there's a lack of knowledge and or data and a lack of access to past scenarios and or how past modeling exercises were done. And that's why we aim to develop in-country capacities for modeling in our partner countries. For example, in Kazakhstan, we have we work with 2 national entities, 2 institutes, and co-create together with them and international consultancies hybrid model. And they are involved in all the steps of the model development. And this ensures that they know how it can be applied and hopefully can update this in the future then on their own. And this question of how to approach the long-term scenario analysis and whether or not to build modeling capacities in countries is one where this concept of different levels of comprehensiveness is very suitable. So in some countries, it just you just don't have the institutes that are capable of doing that. Then of course you need to contract someone to support you, but it's important to ensure that you receive not only the results, but also get access to the model, and that the underlying assumptions, the data inputs, etc., are well documented so that you can build on it in the future. And I just wanted to mention a short example from Costa Rica, which shows how beneficial it can be to invest actually in modeling capacities. And improve the data over time. So you don't need to have it at the beginning. Costa Rica had their first INDC prepared quite quickly with limited data and relying mainly on qualitative scenario-based policymaking. And but then in 2018, they started with the development of the decarbonization plan, and which is their LTS. And this was a very data-driven policy exercise with also heavy reliance on modeling inputs. And now Costa Rica is updating their NDCs and building heavily on these results and the tool set, but they are still complementing it more with new approaches such as assumption-based planning. And this time they also have broader stakeholder co-creation. And I think this is a really good way to see how you can evolve over time and amend the approach and build on it. And by the way, they, in order to avoid the huge effort every 5 years, this for the NDC development, Costa Rica has come up with a national ambition cycle proposal to institutionalize these processes. Yeah, and I think one last aspect, this aspect of resilience is one that is often not reflected, I have the impression, or it just appears somehow. And I think this is really a good argument to bring also finance and economic and planning ministers on board. It can have tools that show where your country and your economy is vulnerable. And we have 3 countries piloting such modeling efforts. And I would encourage all other countries to also delve into this. It's a resilient economic modeling approaches in Vietnam, Kazakhstan, and Georgia.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just one very quick additional question, if it is possible for you to answer quickly on that. As we heard, it is strongly recommended to consolidate the NDC update with the LTS. What's actually your observations in the countries you are working with, and in are those processes actually aligned, maybe besides even the Costa Ricans?
Yeah. So I think that while there is an interest in preparing long-term strategies, we observe that the priority was set on submitting an updated NDC, and very often countries have restricted or limited resources, and so opted for the NDC now. But yeah, in Kazakhstan, for example, the NDC update and the LTS elaboration run in parallel, and but they inform each other. So the LETS process is supported by GIZ, the NDC update by the World Bank and UNDP, but the LETS modeling is harmonized as much as possible with the NDC modeling in terms of assumptions. And so we provided also our times model to the NDC modelers and aligned the CGE models. And Uganda is also an interesting case. COVID-19 has led to severe delays in many countries, but in Uganda, the focus also had been initially mainly on the NDC, and the LTS would have been finalized after the NDC. But due to some delays caused by the lockdown that affected mainly the NDC update, we have now the situation that actually there are already some results of the LTS pre-work that can inform the NDC update, and the data can be shared, assumptions can be aligned in some cases. And this is very important, the stakeholder engagement processes are aligned now. And so last week, the Inception workshop took place for both processes together. And I think it's a great opportunity to showcase how both processes can be aligned and interlinked, and that you need the long-term vision, but also narrow it down to what can be next steps for the next 5 years.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. I would like to propose to take up one question from the audience. It's a question from Danny Robertson, and I would like to address it to you, Julie. If anyone from the panel would like to add on later on, please feel free to do that. I just need to warn you from a technical point of view, I can only see the person who's speaking. So in case another colleague from the panel would like to add, you just need to speak up, I believe. Yes, Danny Robertson asks, I wonder if there are any insights from LTS being developed in low resource settings, in particular, how are scenarios being developed without emissions data, perhaps using exploratory narrative scenarios? Julie, my proposal would be, I would kindly ask you to react to this question.
Yes, thanks. I think Lisa already went into the direction of answering this question with the Costa Rican example. I can bring also another example from the Marshall Islands that did a similar approach. They also had unclear emissions data and then basically developed high-level scenarios without going into the details. The first step was to then identify or trying to identify which sectors are the highest emitters. And what they also did in their long-term strategy that they submitted is to basically highlight which would be the next steps. So I think we come back to this iterative perspective where first a country can try to, with available resources, lay down the first analysis and then make a bit of a plan of what could be good next steps. In the case of the Marshall Islands, they first looked at cooking and lighting, for example, more from a qualitative perspective, acknowledging that this is a source of emissions, and already made the plan to expand the sector to the building sector in a next iteration of the long-term strategy. Another approach as well to develop high-level scenarios without going into the details is to look at global pathways. So generally, we know that the energy sector can be one of the sectors to decarbonize first, as the technologies available are more straightforward. Or also, we know that in general emissions should aim for net zero around 2050, CO2 emissions. So it can also be a high level scenario and then backcasting from 2050 to nowadays. There are also, as I mentioned before, sectoral benchmarks. So for example, making use of non-greenhouse gas targets, such as the last internal combustion engine car sold by a given date, so for example 2035. This can also help to develop scenarios when emission data is lacking.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'd like to move on to Tom, and what I would like to do to share a question from the audience and combine it with an own question I had to you. I believe a very strong question partly tackled is the question, how can countries actually ensure that their long-term strategies are really aligned with the Paris Agreement objectives? And of course, this calls for a whole government approach of planning. And we do have one question in this context coming from Esther Wangombe from Kenya. She would like to understand more about the whole government approach to LTS development, because in most countries, one government ministry has to be in charge to coordinate the process. Tom, would you be able to answer this and elaborate on the questions?
Thanks, Ilka. So regarding how can countries align themselves with the Paris Agreement, I can say something there, and then maybe I would hand over to Silat to talk a bit more about the whole government approach on the on aligning to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So as several of my colleagues have mentioned, there is an increasing volume of evidence in which direction we need to go. Some of this is not available yet at the regional, country, sector level, and that makes it very difficult to plan. But we have at least clarity on the direction that we're going in, and we know that all countries are moving towards net negative emissions in the second half of the century. So countries already have a good benchmark for what direction they need to go in to be Paris compatible. That said, there's a huge number of uncertainties for every country, and there's emission sources that cannot be tackled yet where we don't have solutions. And I think in some cases it's okay to be honest about a situation that we're putting out pathways that are not Paris compatible. It's one thing to not be able to aim for Paris compatibility, but as long as we're transparent about that and we're setting out the reasons why we still face some limitations, then this constructiveness can also be beneficial for developing a dialogue and finding solutions to those remaining emission sources. So to summarize that, I would say the direction is clear to aim for net negative emissions in the second half of the century, but countries have to be realistic about what they know they can do, what they can commit to, and then be very transparent about where they see their limitations so that we can really collectively have a dialogue about addressing some of these issues.
And probably just on the whole of government sort of question, I think the straightforward sort of approach is that there will obviously be a coordinating ministry that actually looks at the long-term strategy. But in countries where either there's sort of a mandate from head of state to actually undertake a long-term strategy with a certain type of ambition, we see that all the ministries come together. Or you could sort of think of institutionalizing, like Lisa mentioned in Costa Rica, where you actually have some sort of a forum which has representatives from different ministries that actually deliberate on the sort of strategy that is required. The problem generally occurs is that a particular ministry coordinating the long-term strategy ends up talking about sectoral solutions that might not be within their core mandate to actually undertake, and you need the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Heavy Industries or the Ministry of energy efficiency, whatever relevant sort of line ministries are there, they need to be brought in. There have been cases in which governments, when they started undertaking their long-term strategy, asked particular sectors to present their sort of respective plans towards the broader sort of goal that they're aiming towards. So sort of having a bottom-up approach from the different sort of stakeholders to input into the strategy. So it's not just a matter of a coordinating ministry finishing the job of doing all the long-term strategy narrative and vision and everything else without necessarily backing it up with the sort of consensus that is required, plus only sort of for the sake of it holding stakeholder consultations as a tokenistic sort of measure of sort of wide consultation. They hold one or two stakeholder consultations. I don't think that would necessarily amount to a whole of government approach. So there has to be an intention of the coordinating ministry to bring in the views of those ministries that would technically have to implement the sort of transformation envisioned in the long-term strategy. If you don't take those into account, then it's sort of not a whole of government approach. And just to also say, it should be a whole of government, whole of society sort of a collaboration where you are actually reaching out to a lot of people, because their lives will be impacted because of the decisions that are being taken in the long-term strategy. So it will have to be a more thorough and consultative process, because the task at hand is a lot more transformative in nature and could create a lot of backlash if not undertaken properly, or if certain sort of parts of the society are not necessarily deliberated with. I think that would result in a sort of inefficient long-term strategy that is good on paper but really doesn't work in practice.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. I'm looking a bit at the time. We have 6 minutes left for our webinar today, and there are two interesting questions, or rather one very interesting country case from Serbia, and a question I would actually propose we combine that. Alexander Popovic shared some information on the Serbian example, and my proposal would actually be, Alexander, that we shortly unmute you so you could share the information from Serbia with the audience. If you would agree, our colleague would unmute you, and if you allow, it would be very interesting actually to hear a bit from your side where the work in Serbia is based on, to which extent modeling capacities were used, and or maybe also new modeling capacities were built up and how you worked, or the Serbian government worked with any modeling gaps which might have been there. Alexander, would you agree to share more information from your side directly?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk on this webinar. I wanted to share just an example from Serbia, where I was actually involved when I was working in the Ministry of Environment on developing of the long-term strategy. The process took actually more than 2 years while the team was changed. So the process is quite long, and it takes a lot of interaction with different stakeholders. All the ministries needs to be involved, so they need to be informed about modeling, and data gathering should come from them also. So I'm quite interested if this strategy will be adopted this year, as it was finished last year and it's still not adopted. In the meanwhile, the update of the NDCs is underway, which is of course informed by the modeling that was done under the strategy. So it's like recommended in the study the New Climate Institute presented. So we are having a right process, but the adoption is a little bit lacking. So I think that the example is quite well. If you are interested in the modeling capacities, it was done by external modeling capacities using Prime's model mainly, also other models depending on the sector. So it's quite informed by actually the targets that the EU has toward 2030 targets for emission reduction, RES employment, and so on. So yeah, we are waiting for the adoption of the strategy, and hopefully it will be soon. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I would like to take also the opportunity to very quickly provide the floor to Danny Robertson. I would kindly ask you to provide us with a very quick insight from your side regarding the example of Tonga. I understand that you can share some information from this country where actually a rather narrative and qualitative approach was used. If you would agree, our colleague would unmute you.
Great, thank you very much for providing the digital stage, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been really interesting. So we're still in the process of supporting Tonga to develop its long-term strategy. They're intending to submit before COP next year to the UNFCCC. And as I mentioned in the comment, it's a situation of very low capacity, and I really do appreciate the guidance document that was putting out acknowledging the different starting points that countries can have, because Tonga is in that category, and so there isn't any reliable or robust emissions data that we can use, and so the scenario modelling will take a narrative form. And so at the moment we're exploring what's using the 3 Ps, the cone of possibility, looking at plausible, possible, and probable for Tonga, and that's quite specific also to Pacific Islands. It's not the same scope of technologies and initiatives that these countries can take in the Pacific or in any island really, so it's also tailored for that. And what we're working towards, I should mention that those scenarios that we're working on are set against a vision that has already been established in one of our first workshops. And once we've developed those scenarios, we'll test them again with stakeholders. And so what we're finding certainly at this end of the spectrum of quantitative and qualitative strategies, we're very much at the qualitative end, is the need for participatory processes and really undertaking technical analysis, but sense checking that and providing that back to the participants and making sure that you're on track with what their vision, what they intended for their vision. And so I'm certainly available to talk to others who are in this similar position. It's been a very challenging context to work remotely as well, but also to do this all qualitatively, while still obviously meeting Tonga's ambition to get to net zero by 2050. And so I'm certainly available for others on the call. If you want to connect me, 2050 Pathways platform and Sid have my details. So yeah, do reach out. We're very happy to discuss this. But I'll hand back over to the panel.
Dani, thank you very much. I see we are approaching, or actually are reaching the end of the time for today's webinars. I had a couple of questions I would have loved to ask to the panel, but I would like to leave it actually with the last question to all the panelists. And I would kindly ask you to take 10 seconds to answer, if that is possible for you. I know it's a complex question, but rather a question to get your impression and your views on the question. How is the attitude and awareness regarding decarbonization transformation in your view changed in the past 5 years? And actually, what would you predict will happen in the next 5 to 10 years? Siddharth, maybe we quickly start with you and then we go on.
I think the next 5 years, we'd probably see a lot more smaller economies, lower middle income and LDCs actually undertaking the long-term strategies, which is not the case right now. I think the other bit would be that the net zero sort of benchmark would become a lot more commonplace. So we will see much more revision. This is sort of outside of the scope that I think long-term strategies in general will gain more traction as sort of an underlying instrument to actually look at multiple transformations, including discussions around trade that could actually be embedded in the long-term strategies. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Siddharth. Lisa.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Siddharth, so don't repeat that. But to add, I hope that we, so the awareness has risen a lot, I think, for this topic also due to Fridays for Future and many movements, and that we see also climate impacts already. I hope really that it's early, or the awareness rises more and early enough to get aware of the investment cycles that are ongoing now, and so that clear signals are given by the governments that certain types of technologies can't be installed anymore since they are not compatible. And so here we really need a good signal. For example, in Germany, in the industrial sector, in the next 10 years, if we don't manage to give this clear signal, we are locked in. So we really need clear signals now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I would kindly ask Tom maybe to speak for all the colleagues of New Climate, quickly.
Sure, thanks. So I think in the last 5 years, we've seen that ambition setting at the national level has been a very difficult process, regardless of the situation that the country is in economically. That doesn't make a difference. It's something that's difficult. Once LTS are on the table after 2020, then my expectation or hope would be that there's much more clarity, more consensus on what needs to happen, and that this ambition raising process could be more mainstreamed in the future. Another expectation I would have is that there might be a revival of multilateralism in the next years as the US comes back into the Paris Agreement, as the EU is bold enough to put further more targets, as China steps forwards and puts targets there, and this collective attitude that has been completely missing in the last years can really underpin the ambition raising mechanism. That's my hope.
Thank you very much, Tom. With that, I would like to thank, of course, all the panelists, all the input providers for contributing to today's event, but of course, especially also to the audience. Thank you for joining the webinar today. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the webinar has been recorded and will be made available, so you can revisit it, or you could also, of course, share with other interested colleagues. Yes, thank you very much, and I would like to close today's webinar with that.